A Nigerian professor, Peter Ogban, has been sentenced to 3 years in prison by a high court sitting in Akwa Ibom State for election fraud. The court on Thursday found Professor Ogban guilty of fraudulent manipulation of election results, publishing and announcing a false result. Ogban, a professor of soil science at the University of Calabar, was a returning officer in the 2019 general elections in Akwa Ibom, Northwest District, for which he was charged with manipulating the election results of 2 local government areas. Professor Ogban had told the court how the results of the election were falsified to favor the All Progressive Congress candidate, Godswill Akpabio, who was seeking a return to the Senate after he defected from the PDP. While reacting to the development, Akpabio said he was rather a victim of the fraud committed by Professor Ogban in the election. He also accused the Independent National Electoral Commission, INEC, of twisting the truth. Public commentator Adeniyi Kunnu joins us now to share his perspective. Well, good to have you on the show, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me on the show this morning.
Great. Yes. As you heard in my introduction, Professor Peter Ogban was found guilty of electoral fraud and was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment. What do you make of all of this development as we prepare for 2023 general elections?
One of the key ingredients of constitutional democracy is that when courts give verdicts, nobody has anything to say other than to accept what the court has said. So that is already signed and sealed. But there are also happenings that become very important for us to quite understand, which is that many people are missing the narrative. Don't forget that in that election, Mr. Ekpeyong of the PDP was actually declared winner of that election. And from the position of the court has actually nullified that election and has instructed INEC to withdraw the certificate of return given to the man that was declared winner by Professor Ogban in that February 23rd, 2019 election. While the narrative is getting muddled up is that people are saying that Akpabio actually was the person who, who more or less employed Professor Ogban to do that. So it's kind of getting muddled. But one thing that we must take from this is that the wheel of justice, when it comes to electoral malpractice, appears to be grinding very quickly. Let me, for the benefit of retrospection, tell the people viewing us that the Rivers State election that led to the administration which terminated before or after the 2019 election got a lot of people also nabbed. Many returning officers, many INEC officials actually took money in the Rivers State elections, and they also, they were thrown in jail. So what I'm saying is, I think that it is good that we are beginning to have our court hold things strongly. But if you check what is happening in Akwa Ibom State, I think people perhaps are just getting out of the narratives. What is most significant, and that is in my estimation, is that the court has actually held the position. The court has ascertained that there was electoral malpractice. The court has told the public that you cannot do such a thing and get away with it. And I believe very strongly that if INEC is empowered the more, and the courts also are able to act independently, most definitely every other press statement, every other comment made might be very irrelevant. But the fact that the court has actually done what it was ab initio created to do, which is ensure justice is done anytime cases are brought before it.
I understand, and I accept what you said at the beginning of your first answer there, where you said that first and foremost, I mean, this is a judgment, and that is it, for lack of a better term. But as we delve deeper into this conversation, the professor himself, is it clear about whether or not he himself has accepted the fact that he did in fact do this, or has he maintained his innocence throughout? Because I think while we can accept that this is a good example of justice being just, when it comes to politics in this country, it can be a very, very dirty game. And ultimately, people in power have just that power over those without it. So could this be an example of a powerless person, for lack of a better term, being put in a cage when perhaps there could be more to the story than he, in fact, was involved in electoral fraud and has been reprimanded according to the law?
Now, in the first place, I want to set the record very straight. You said something about politics being dirty in this part of the world. Politics the world over is very dirty. But one of the things that civilized society, or societies that were thought to be civilized, have done is they've been able to legitimize many of what we are still operating as those who occupy non-state actor realm. Let me say that very clearly. In the US, there are a group of people that they call lobbyists. Lobbyists are more or less, in local parlance, political jobbers. So what did the American people do? They tried to legalize a group of people who influence decisions, who try to push policies, and in the course of doing that, money changes hands. Many people don't know that. So politics the world over is dirty. It's not peculiar to Nigeria. Having said that, after this verdict, Professor Ogban said certain things. As a professor of soil science, somebody who has attained that height, he apologized and asked for leniency. Don't forget that this particular verdict comes with a 100,000 fine. Certain things that he said included the fact that he has an elderly mother, he's got the wife, he's got the children, and other dependents, that going to prison for 3 years most definitely would, take away his means of livelihood. The courts will decide if to be lenient or not. But one of the things we also need to take out of this particular one is the fact that for somebody to have actually apologized, no matter the innocence anybody claims here, don't forget this is 2021. So that particular case has been in court plus or minus over 1 year, going to a year and a half right now, because if we held the election in 2019 and this is 2021, that's about 2 years. So what I'm saying in essence is the court has taken its time, even while the pandemic was on, to continue to dig into these issues, and I've been able to come to conclude that at this moment, we have found evidence that Professor Ogban messed up the process he was supposed to preserve and actually be just in handling. So we cannot really talk much about the innocence of the professor, and it is of equal inconsequence to talk about the fact that he was hired or not to do what he has done. The central kernel of discussion should be that was a professor that was meant to protect the mandate of the people. Did he do what he was supposed to do? The answer is not quite what he did, because the court has told us that he manipulated figures, he cancelled at certain areas, yet knowing full well all of the inadequacies, inconsistencies in that election that he oversaw, he still declared somebody a winner and said that it should be returned as the winner of the election. So we may not need to also argue that further because the court has done its finding. So what is left now is for the parties. Don't forget that the Akpabio team had already filed a particular motion in court, and I think it's on its way to the Supreme Court as we speak, where he said that INEC is also part of the suit. The resident electoral commissioner of Akwa Ibom State, Barrister Mike Igini, is also part of this particular discussion. And when it gets to the Supreme Court, I believe most definitely that we'll still have to hear that part of the story. This is just half, because whatever it is that you set up as litigation, it has to be exhausted if at all you have not withdrawn the case. So we're still waiting to see that part of the conversation moving forward. So the picture we're trying to create is about the professor, and of course, those who participated in the election, who didn't do quite the things they were supposed to do. And I also want to say very clearly, look, going forward, 2023 is around the corner. There are certain staggered elections. For instance, we'll likely have election in Anambra State later this year or next year. There are some staggered elections, about 7 to 8 states or thereabouts. These elections must also be INEC testing waters to really be able to stand up tall. And I want Professor Mahmoud Yakub, who obviously is listening to us as we speak, to do a lot to protect the mandate of the people. Once these things are done, then we can say that elections can count. Because as we speak, don't forget that the last Chief Justice of Nigeria, Justice Walter Onoge, he mentioned something about speeding up everything that has to do with deciding electoral issues in court. And I believe that this is one of the things that they should do moving forward.
All right, Mr. Adeniyi, we're going to go on a short break. And when we come back, we'll continue on this conversation. Please stay with us. Welcome back to the morning show. Still with us is public affairs commentator Adeniyi Kunnu. Now, before we went on a break, you mentioned that the professor will appeal his case. So, during the case, the counsel to the professor had prayed the court to pardon the professor, saying that the act for which he was found guilty had no effect on the said elections, stating that the professor was a sought-after man in the academic world and should not be deprived of his freedom. Now, when we think of a professor of such pedigree, though, they are considered to be role models, to the society. Now, do you think that INEC should suspend the use of university professors for electoral duties, having seen, something like this happen?
All right, you have asked a very dangerous question, and I'll give you an equally dangerous answer.
All right.
Because there are lots of things that are connected to what we have at the moment. In the first place, you're talking about a country where the academia has been battered by the recurrences of strike actions, by the non-payment of allowances, by the deprivation of those who are supposed to be the beacon of hope within scholarship circles over the years. And these people see what their colleagues in other parts of the world are actually enjoying, or the privileges they have, the research support they get. And you also see that these same people that you are depriving of all these privileges of their respected offices go to the same markets, travel out to the same countries that those who pack all the money in the country go to. I tell you, the aspect of being perfect is the exclusive preserve of the gods. That's a fact of the matter. Every human being, maybe yours is not when it comes to money matters, maybe yours is when it comes to talking brashly, or maybe when it comes to reacting angrily. We all have our imperfections. So the perfection we work towards as human beings, we daily do that, we check ourselves daily, so that we increase the quotient of the positivity of our attitude. Having said that, I had mentioned earlier that the professor, ditto every other professor, should appropriately or ideally be role models. But you have to understand that the cankerworm has really eaten deep into the fabric of the Nigerian nation. And because of that, every facet of the Nigerian nation is affected. The academia, the political circles, you're talking about the social structure, you're talking about the family life. So it simply means that what you perhaps would have done with a little less effort in terms of how you react or respond to things has become pretty much difficult within the difficult Nigerian context that should not be in the first place. So role models, yes, because the professor would have actually, overseen, would have actually, taken charge of a lot of PhD students, a lot of master students, taught a lot of people who have gone on to become great people, and they will be looking up to him in a lot of ways. So many of them will be discouraged now. But I can say that the professor can be pardoned, because at times in life, you need a second chance to realize you don't go back to certain things. And I believe that the professor must have learned his lesson. But that should not subtract from the fact that he has also mentored a lot of people. Don't forget, we are talking about a man who is a husband to a woman, who is a father to children, and who is a source of succor to many other people. We can't take away or discount the things that the professor has done in life that are positive, even if we consider this something that should not have been associated with him. So I must say here that the professor actually has fallen into the ditch. His legs have not been broken, even if the mud in the ditch has rubbed his feet. I believe that this particular correctional center that he'll be going to is for him to get out of the ditch, get some water to wash himself, and try to reinvent himself in newer ways than he had done before. So let us not take away the fact that he remains a role model to a lot of people. Then also know that his family at the moment is completely devastated. Don't forget about it. We're talking about those that has a very strong bloodline connection and love for this man, those who daily look up to him when he returns from work and he talks to them. So you can't take away those things that are the reality of his life because of this electoral fraud. It is unfortunate, though, that he happens to be the scapegoat at the highest of levels. Then at the same time, INEC should continue.
Sorry to interrupt you there. This was exactly the point of my first question about whether or not you used the word scapegoat there. So if we're talking about blame and justice, is what you're saying, that there's more in terms of this story, this allegation of electoral fraud? There is more blame and perhaps prison sentences to go around?
Well, if you're talking about him, we cannot say that the professor had acted independently. If I heard you correctly, you're talking about the blames going around. You're talking about the fact that beyond this man are other accomplices that should be dug through and found, which I agree to. But let us tell you this, that we can only wait for any other thing that the court has to tell us in this regard, because for now, the only person who is in the eye of the storm is Professor Ogban. And until another person comes up, picked up, fingered as an accomplice in this particular very, very sad experience, I think we can just keep it at the professor, because he happens to be the focal point. Every other thing we talk about is at a point of perhaps, maybe what we're just assuming, or some of the things we feel, maybe conjectures, basically. So let us wait for anything that might come after that. It's a landmark judgment, no doubt, but at the moment, Professor Ogban is in the eye of the storm.
Right. All right. Well, let's shift gears. Let's talk about the role of politicians in electoral fraud, as they are the key instigators, as we've experienced in the past. If you would recall, last year, the U.S. government slammed visa restrictions on some individuals for allegedly rigging the November 2019 governorship elections, I believe, in Kogi and Bayelsa states, as well as in the run-up to the September and October 2020 Edo and Ondo governorship polls. Do you think this will deter politicians from committing electoral fraud as we prepare for 2023, or what other measures can be put in place to, help secure that our 2023 elections will be guaranteed?
Let me say this. Electoral fraud is more or less like the twin sister of political desperation. Electoral fraud is the twin sister. Apologies to the female gender. I don't mean no disrespect. Because when you talk about electoral fraud, it multiplies. And we know that naturally our women actually, they are the ones that God has given the privilege of fertility and to produce for us to regenerate. So that's why I've associated that particular gender to it. And I'm sorry once again. But I must say very clearly here that politicians in a society that doesn't function as it should will continue to have incremental desperation and be associated with electoral fraud. It therefore means that INEC should not only strengthen its capacity to beam its light on those who are involved in electoral fraud as its own officers, but also on politicians. Now, you're talking about the electoral fraud that has resulted in what the U.S. Actually did. Don't forget, they talked about the things that happened in Kogi State. And don't forget about that, there has been a lot of reactions after that position by Yaya Bello himself.
Yes.
Because if you check it, he alluded to the presidential election that brought in the current administration. And let me say this, there were lots of things that happened even in the presidential election of 2019 that it seems to me that INEC didn't do quite a thorough job. Because let me tell you very clearly, INEC said, and I must quote Barrister Mike Igini, that they have a particular server. It is on record where the election results will go to, it will be sent to. The landmark judgment against Atiku Abubakar, who was a flag bearer for the PDP, was about a certain server. INEC Rec in Akwa Ibom said something about server. Certain monies were allocated for that particular thing. So you'd find out that INEC itself must come clean in a lot of ways. You don't talk about a server if indeed the server has not been signed in an amended Electoral Act of 2010. Do not forget that these issues are there in the open for researchers who perhaps want to verify what I'm saying now. So it means that everybody who is involved in the election business in this country must endeavor a measure or a level of truth that will not make us look ridiculous in the eyes of the global village. So when we're talking about election fraud, INEC has a responsibility. You're talking about election fraud, INEC must strengthen its disciplinary measure against politicians who are the ones who consistently bring money to those that fall into the ditch of this very serious monetary temptation. So at every level, INEC must get the biggest hammer for this, biggest hammer. But I want to say, as a necessary addition, that the use of professors in an election or in any election must continue. Because if we look at the trust quotient in the country, people in the academia appear to me to be those that we can still trust to a great extent to do these things for us. Because I tell you, the trust fabric within the political class is very, very limited. So the academia is still the hope we have, and perhaps a number or two technocrats or fields that appears not to have been tainted. So moving forward, I think INEC has a lot to do. Then the institutions of government need to be strengthened more and financially enabled to do what it has to do for the benefit of Nigerians and their mandates.
Understood. When we talk about elections, of course, there's a lot of stake for a lot of people. If we look at Georgia, for example, the state of Georgia over in the United States,
yes,
we know that they've just passed a sweeping list of new electoral reforms, one of them being that it's now illegal in Georgia to pass food or water to people who are in a queue to cast their ballot. And in a state like that, which already has criticisms to its neck about the suppression of votes, most especially when it comes to black populations, do you see coming over back to Nigeria, a situation where INEC or whomever in charge of electoral laws puts themselves in a position where the sanctity of casting a ballot is more protected objectively, rather than, as we're seeing in Georgia, for example, they're making it more difficult, the Republicans, that is, making it more difficult for perceived Democratic voters to be able to cast their vote in a state already making it difficult for them to do so?
Yes, let us say this. For Nigerians, I think because you started from Georgia, it's important I go to the United States of America where you started this conversation. Now, if you realize what happened in the election that the U.S. had last year, you might disagree because you might be a supporter of Joe Biden or Donald Trump. But the reality is, many of the changes made towards the election of 2020 in the U.S. were wrongly made. And I must say that for the blacks, they are coming to terms with the reality of their decision now. So having said that, let me come back to this country. Imagine a situation where there are times in a state you don't have local government elections for the entire tenure of a particular administration. Umaru Tanko Al-Makura of Nasarawa State, if my memory serves me well, did not have a local government election for the entire period that he was in power. He did 2 terms. I'm hopeful that nobody will correct me on that, because as of that period, I had 1 or 2, things that I was doing in the north. So I was in that state doing certain things. And the question would be that why will we leave state elections or local government elections, knowing that local governments are the most important to the people, to the whims and caprices of state governors? That is one of the reforms that I'm hoping to see, where when INEC says that there is an election at the federal level, INEC must also set timelines that within a particular period, there must be local government elections. The state governors can be the ones to conduct it by their respective independent electoral commissions, but INEC must stipulate that you cannot have local government administrators in states beyond 6 months, 8 months, or 1 year after you have had the general elections that brought in the governors or, of course, the president, because it's becoming commonplace across the country. So, as you rightly said, my sister, we must strengthen our institutions by reviewing the policies first and ensuring that these institutions are enabled to be able to go the full hog, right, without anybody bearing its own weight against the law. So I think that is where we should begin from.
Adeniyi Kunnu, thank you very much for your time here. We've enjoyed this conversation.